Hey guys. This is part 4 of What If Sasuke Was in Lord of the Rings. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 16, Troubles on the Path. Location, Rohan. The convoy went slowly onwards, heading for Helm's Deep. They were close, but they were not there, and so they had to be careful still. Theoden knew this, and so as he rode on, he looked at 2 of his guards. Hama, Gomling, ride ahead and scout the path, he told them. As you command, Theoden King, Hama said, bowing his head in acknowledgement. The 2 rode forward to the head of the convoy, passing the people. Some of them looked at them as they passed, wondering what they were doing and or where they were going. Others, like Aragorn, Eowyn, and Boromir, knew what they were doing and said nothing as they passed. When they reached the head of the convoy and rode beyond it, they passed both Sasuke and Legolas, who were keeping a lookout. "Aren't we already doing what they are doing?" Sasuke asked with a small hint of sarcasm as he watched them pass. Legolas didn't answer, prompting him to look at the elf. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Legolas answered. "But something is out there." Meanwhile, Hama and Gomling had ridden far enough to be out of sight of the convoy. They were passing a rocky cliff when their horses began to fight against the reins, wanting to turn and run. "What is it, Hama?" Gomling asked his fellow guard and friend. "I'm not sure," Hama answered. They started to look around for what had scared their horses, but the one place they didn't look was up. On the top of the cliff was an orc riding what looked to be a cross between a hyena and a wolf, looking down on them. The orc kicked the creature's sides, prompting it to leap down at them with a roar. Both of the horsemen looked up to see where the roar had come from, but it was already too late. The creature smashed into Hama's horse, making it fall to the ground, breaking its neck in the process, and throwing Hama out of his saddle. He hit the ground hard and was dazed for a moment. When the dizziness faded and he realized what had happened, he tried to reach for his sword. But the creature was already coming at him with jaws agape, and all he could do was scream. His scream was heard by the people in the convoy. And it was also heard by Sasuke and Legolas. "Shit," Sasuke swore. "Come on," he told Legolas, already running ahead. The elf was not far behind him. Gomling shook himself out of his shock of seeing the orc rider and Hama getting killed. He knew what that creature was the orc was riding. "Wargs!" he yelled out as he drew his sword from its scabbard and moved in to attack. They exchanged a few strikes of the swords, but he knew that his horse was paralyzed with fear from the sight of the warg. He couldn't move, and he also saw that the warg was backing up slightly, getting ready to leap again. But an arrow suddenly buried itself in the warg's eye, killing it and making it throw its rider from the saddle in its death throes. Gomling looked at where the arrow had come from to see both Sasuke and Legolas coming down the hill he and Hama had ridden down just seconds ago. When Sasuke saw that the rider was still alive, he moved quickly and swiftly killed it with a kunai to its throat. But he knew that couldn't be the only one. The sight of a small, and ugly-looking, horn at its side confirmed his suspicions. He heard footsteps on the hill and turned to see Aragorn looking down at them. "He's a scout," he shouted up to the ranger, who turned back and ran down the hill. While Gomling followed him, the elf and shinobi went in the other direction. As the 2 men ran back to the convoy, Theoden saw their frantic speed and quickly urged his horse to a gallop, racing to meet them. "What is it? What do you see?" he asked them. "Wargs!" shouted Aragorn as he went for the horse he had borrowed. "We're under attack." When they heard the word warg, the people of Edoras began to panic. They knew of wargs and what they could do to their prey. They started to panic, and that dreaded word began to travel down the length of the convoy, causing more panic to build up. Boromir, from atop his horse, saw the panic building. "Get them out of here!" he shouted for any to hear. Some did hear him and began to usher the people in the convoy back to some order, but it wasn't enough. As Aragorn climbed atop his horse and took the reins, Theoden turned his horse to face the convoy. "All riders to the head of the column," he ordered in a loud voice. Gimli heard this order, and immediately turned his own horse. "Come on! Get me up here! I'm a rider," he told the people next to him, who were also helping him get on the horse. "Come on!" he shouted once he was actually on. As the riders began to mobilize and head for the head of the convoy, Theoden went to Yoin. "You must lead the people to Helm's Deep, and make haste," he told her. "I can fight," she responded. She had been taught how to use the spear, the sword, and the shield. She was a shield maiden, waiting to show her skills on the field of battle. But her uncle had a different opinion on that. "No! You must do this for me," he told her. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she turned back to her horse. "Lord Boromir, please help my niece get the people to Helm's Deep," he called out to the Captain General of Gondor. "As you command, King Theoden," he replied, already urging his horse close to Yoin. If truth be told, he was secretly glad to have that option. His strength had been leaving him more and more often of late, and he did not know if it would stay if he fought. Glad to have heard those words, the king turned his horse around. "Follow me," he shouted for all the riders to hear. They did hear and followed after him. Gimli tried to follow as well, only to have some difficulty with the horse. "Forward. I mean, charge forward," he told it, but it went backwards instead. Knowing that she had been given an order to help the people there, and also knowing that she would not disobey it for personal glory, Yoin turned towards them. "Make for the lower ground," she told them, urging them onto the lower ground. "That's it! Go on!" Gimli exclaimed as he finally managed to get the horse moving forward instead of back, urging it forward along with the other riders. "Stay together," Yoin told the fleeing people, who were already bunching up around their families. As she and Boromir herded them down to the path of relative safety, she looked back to see Aragorn. Their eyes connected for a moment before he turned around to follow the banner of the white horse of Rohan to battle. When Legolas and Sasuke reached the top of the hill they had run up, the rest of the Warg attacked force riding their way, filling the airs with their howls. Sasuke didn't waste any time. He began flipping through hand seals and took a deep breath. "Katan, Hozenka no Jutsu, Fire Style, Phoenix Sage Fire Technique," he said before spitting out multiple small fireballs that immediately flew towards the wargs. Some struck and set the wargs they hit ablaze, but some also missed. "Give me cover," he told Legolas before suddenly charging down the hill towards the incoming wargs. The elf was caught off guard by the request, but he pulled out an arrow, nocked it, and fired it at the wargs, taking one and its rider down. He shot a few more arrows, hitting his target each time, before the riders of Rohan appeared behind him. Seeing that Gimli was riding a horse from the back of the saddle, he took that as an invitation and leapt onto the saddle. Meanwhile, Sasuke was charging at the wargs at full speed. One of the orc riders saw him and urged his warg forward, intent on taking first blood, unaware of that position had already been taken by the scout. Sasuke saw this and turned towards him to meet his attack, drawing the katana. But when it looked like Warg rider and shinobi were about to hit one another, the shinobi of the two leapt into the air. The orc only had time to look up in surprise before the katana entered its brain, killing him instantly. Sasuke kicked the body off of the warg and swiftly sat in the saddle. The warg tried to throw him off, but one look at his Sharingan, and it was under his control. "Works every time," Sasuke thought to himself as he turned the warg around to run back at the enemy lines. The other riders, both men and orc, were surprised to see him do something like that. But the men weren't ones to not take advantage of something like that and urged their mounts forward faster, shouting war cries for the enemy to hear. The warg riders did the same thing, and when the two sides clashed together, things quickly became a mess. The riders of Rohan had better weaponry than the orcs and knew how to maneuver their horses. The problem was that the wargs themselves were also deadly. Their scent, if they got close enough in the right direction, was enough to make a horse still in fear. They also weren't above leaping up and knocking the horses down, making thrown riders easy targets. As his blood got pumping at the sight of battle all around him, Gimli accidentally fell off of the saddle he was sharing with Legolas. And while the elf rode on, he did look back to see that the dwarf had landed safely. He got back up onto his feet and grabbed hold of his axe. He saw his first target was a warg who had lost its rider but was feasting on one of the dead horses that began to litter the battlefield. Sensing that someone was watching it, it lifted its head, its jaws bloody from the meat it ate, and saw Gimli standing there. Interested in the prospects of a fresh meal, it leapt over the dead horse and began making its way over to the dwarf. Said dwarf was ready and waiting. "Bring your pretty face to my axe," he challenged the warg, keeping his axe at the ready. The warg accepted the challenge and quickened its pace. But as it was about to leap at him, Legolas came riding back and shot an arrow at it, killing the creature instantly. Needless to say, Gimli was annoyed the elf had interfered. "That one counts as mine," he shouted at Legolas' back. "Look out!" Sasuke shouted at him as he rode past. The dwarf turned to see what he was talking about, only to see a warg right in front of him. He swung his axe at its head, killing it. But it moved in such a way that when it collapsed right on top of him, making him grunt sharply in surprise. But that didn't last long. "Stinking creature," he growled as he began to push the warg off of his body. He stopped when he saw an orc standing over the dead body with a long dagger at the ready. It reached down to grab him, intending on plunging the dagger into his head. However, he grabbed the orc as well and snapped its neck while it was surprised. It fell on top of the warg, adding weight to it. Now that he was dealing with more weight to push off of. And that wasn't the only thing he had to suffer through. "And I thought that the warg smelled bad," he thought to himself as he was forced to smell the dead orc. Sasuke was facing the same thing as he rode the hypnotized warg through the battlefield, attacking the other wargs and orcs. He had, rather unfortunately, been in some situations where he had been forced to smell an orc. The first time he had been forced to do that, as he was sneaking into the orc band camp to rescue a few children stolen from Gondor. The next day or two was spent wondering if he should go back to the elemental nations for the sake of his nose. He may have gone up against people who could rearrange the landscape with ease there, but at least they had the common courtesy to smell decent. But now, he was dealing with the smell of the orcs and the smell of wargs, and it didn't help that he was riding one of said wargs. If one of the Inuzuka clan was here, they'd probably have passed out by now, he thought to himself. But while he was thinking of the entire clan, his mind wandered over to a specific member of the clan, one that had been a friend, of sorts. If he wasn't in the middle of a battle, he would have shaken his head to stop his train of thought. Instead, as he ran down another orc rider and decapitated both rider and warg, he mentally chastised himself. Now isn't the time to reminisce. Focus on the fight. He did just that, going back to the fight. When it had begun and the wargs began attacking the riders themselves, he started running interference. Whenever a warg was about to attack a rider, instead of running past and letting the orc on its back do all the work, he would ride over and kill the warg. It was a good plan and he had protected a good number of the riders. But he could not have the hypnotized warg be everywhere at once and multiple wargs were attacking multiple riders, pulling them down from their saddles and killing them with a snap of their jaws. Still, he did not stop. He rode on through the field of battle, attacking and killing any warg that got too close. He didn't stay in one place either. He rode his warg all around the battlefield, trying to make sure he stayed on. He had ridden a horse a couple of times before, but this was completely different. The other warg riders had taken notice of his tactics, and were now trying to stay on the other side of the battlefield, or were trying to attack him directly. But those tactics did not stop him, and the katana he wielded was dripping with blood from the number of orcs and wargs he killed. How many more are left? He asked himself as he rode after one warg that had tried to go after a rider of Rohan. Only at the last moment, the warg veered off. What was that? Sasuke asked. But it was a passing thought. He was more concerned with going after the warg itself. As he rode after it, another warg rode up beside him with an orc on its back with a bow in its hands. The raven-haired shinobi noticed that the bow with a knocked arrow pointed right at him at the last moment. He swung the katana down at the orc's arms, chopping them off in an instant. The orc howled in pain, but the arrow struck the hypnotized warg instead of its rider, killing it. Sasuke instantly leapt out of the saddle when he felt the warg go into its death throes. He landed on his feet and slashed at the warg that ran beside him, almost cutting it in half but killing it anyway. The handless orc went flying but died when he threw a kunai at it, and striking the head dead in the center. He turned around to see another warg standing over the dead orc and warg that were atop of Gimli. Its intent was obvious. He quickly pulled out another kunai and threw it at the warg, burying it in its eye. It rose up for a brief moment, and then crashed down onto the pile, making the dwarf gasp in pain and surprise. But he was quickly pulled out from beneath the pile from the shinobi himself. Not to complain, Sasuke, but you couldn't have done that a bit sooner? He asked as he got back onto his feet, grabbing his axe. Worry about that later, Sasuke told him as he watched the remaining wargs on the battlefield. Stay back to back. He felt the dwarf's smaller back press against his, and the two of them struck any orc rider or warg that got too close. But they didn't need to stay like that for long. The battle was ending in favor of the men. What wargs and orc riders still living were being driven off. Gimli saw this and relaxed his guard somewhat. I don't think we need to keep this position anymore, lad, he told Sasuke. He took notice of a wounded warg on its side nearby. He went over to it, and with a great cry, buried his axe in its head. As the men of Rohan began to survey the damage that had been done to them by the wargs, Legolas looked around the battlefield. There was someone missing from his sight. Aragorn? He called out as he walked through the field. Both Sasuke and Gimli heard the elf call out and began looking themselves. But they could not see the ranger anywhere. Aragorn? Shouted Gimli, but there was no answer. Now even Theoden and his riders were looking for him. Both elf and shinobi started looking on the field itself, trying to find any trace of where the ranger was. When Legolas neared the nearby cliffside, he heard the sound of a wounded cackle. He looked back and saw a dying orc lying on the ground. Gimli, Theoden, and Sasuke heard the sound as well and saw the orc. Gimli was the first to reach him and placed his axe against his neck. Tell me what happened and I will ease your passing, he told the orc. He's dead, the orc said with a weak cackle. He took a little tumble off the cliff. He grinned monstrously at those words. While the king of Rohan went to the cliff, the elf noticed something in the dying orc's hand. He pried it open and pulled out a jewel that was nothing but magnificent and beautiful. This is the Evenstar, he said to Gimli and Sasuke. It belongs to the Lady Arwen. His voice stopped for a moment. She must have given it to him before we left Rivendell. By the ancestors, no, Gimli said, hoping what that meant wasn't so. Legolas went to the cliff's edge to see if there was anything left of Aragorn. But all he saw was a river that flowed swiftly. The orc cackled once more. Pity you won't be able to find him now, he gurgled with a grin. Sasuke grabbed him by his vest and pulled him up so that they would look one another in the eyes. Suffer, he commanded as his eyes transformed into the Mangekyo Sharingan. Tsukuyomi, he whispered the jutsu's name. The dying orc went from cackling to screaming in a second. He died a second later, but none of the others noticed. They were more concerned about looking down at the river below, trying to find any sign of Aragorn, only to have none. Hearing footsteps behind them, Theoden turned to see Gamelin coming towards them. Get the wounded on horses, he commanded. The wolves of Isengard will return. Leave the dead. Those words made Legolas turn to look at him. But all he did was clasp a hand on the elf's shoulder. Come, he said before walking away. Both Legolas and Gimli stayed where they were, looking down at the river. Legolas, Gimli, we have to go, Sasuke called out to them. They turned back to see the riders already going away from the field of battle. And even though they wanted to keep looking, they knew he was right. Location Eowyn. She and Boromir had led the convoy for the past hour away from the battle. The pace they set was hurried, for they did not want the wargs to catch them. It soon bore fruit as they crested the last small hill and saw the sanctuary standing before them, nestled between the two mountains. Cries of Helm's Deep and We're safe echoed throughout the convoy as more and more people began to see Helm's Deep and they began to run towards to the stronghold. Even Eowyn was relieved to see it, especially when a woman walked to her and said, We're safe, my lady. Thank you. She left before the niece of the king could give a proper response. There is still a walk before us, she said quietly to Boromir, who was by her side. Let them have their joy, he told her. They will be there soon enough. She could find no argument with those words and led the people down the hill, across the valley, and up the causeway to the safety of Helm's Deep. When the guards before the gate opened it to let her and the convoy in, she saw that the rest of Rohan were already there. The people crowded the fortress proper as well as the area behind the deeping wall. It was obvious that Saruman had struck far and wide in Rohan, while Grima held sway over the king. She could only look upon the number of people standing at the entrance to the gate alone before realizing what had to be done. Lord Boromir, could you please escort the people down to the camp so that they might be settled? She asked the man from Gondor. Of course, Lady Eowyn, he said in reply. He turned to the people in the convoy. Follow me, he called out, leading the way. He had been to Helm's Deep before, when he had been a younger man and Gondor and Rohan were still on friendly terms. When they reached the camp, the people who had come from Edoras began to spread out and find people they knew. They hugged one another, relief and gladness to see each other showing in their tears and their smiles. Even the 2 children who had ridden for Edoras found someone. Mama! Shouted the girl as she and her brother ran towards their mother. Eothane! Frida! She said when she saw them running, kneeling down and throwing her arms to catch them in a tight hug. They held on to one another, not ever letting go. Boromir saw this happen and smiled at the sight. It was a good thing that they had reunited. Eowyn was helping take stock of the supplies that had been brought to the fortress. Where is the rest? She asked as she put down a barrel of beard. This is all we could save, my lady, one of the nearby men told her. She looked at the supplies that were there. It was enough to last them long enough, but if they were besieged for a long time, they would run out. Take it to the caves, she ordered. The people around her began to do as she said. Over the din of the people inside the fortress, a voice cried out from the causeway. Make way for the king! Make way for Theoden! Make way for the king, it declared as the Lord of the Mark rode into the fortress with the rest of his riders behind him. His niece heard the voice and saw her uncle. She went to go meet him as he stopped before the keep. But as she met them, she saw that the number of riders was much smaller than the ones that had left the convoy. So few of you have returned, she said as her uncle dismounted. But amongst the riders, there was one she did not see. Our people are safe, Theoden told her. We have paid for it with many lives. He turned around to help a wounded man get off the horse he was riding. Gimli, who already gotten off of the horse he shared with Legolas, walked up to her. My lady, he said to her. She turned her head towards him. Lord Aragorn, where is he? She asked him, worry in her voice. His mouth moved a couple of times, but no words came out at first. But they soon did. He fell, he told her. At first, she did not seem to understand those 2 words. When she did, she looked back at her uncle, trying to see if it was true. He looked at her, feeling her eyes on him, and then looked away as he went up the stairs. That was all the answer she needed, and she had to sit down. Later, when everything had been taken care, the king of Rohan stood on the deeping wall with his men around him. Draw all our forces behind the wall, he ordered them as they saw more and more refugees coming to Helm's Deep. Bar the gate. And set a watch on the surround. What of those who cannot fight, my lord? The women and children? Asked Gimli as they began to walk down the nearby set of stairs. Get them into the caves, he answered. Saruman's arm will have grown long indeed if he thinks he can reach us here, he said mostly to himself as he and his group walked alongside the small stream-like pool of water. Location: Isengard. When Saruman had ordered Grima to tell him about the fortress of Helm's Deep and whatever weakness it may have, he did as he was told. Helm's Deep has one weakness. Its outer wall is solid rock, but for a small culvert at its base, which is little more than a drain. Having heard those words, the White Wizard began preparing something that would take advantage of the small weakness with ease. He had a large iron shell standing on the table in one of his workrooms and filled it with the ingredients needed to make it work. Grima, having watched the entire process from behind him with a candle in hand, only had questions. How can fire undo stone? He asked as he stepped forward and looked into the shell itself to see its contents. What kind of device could bring down the wall? He leaned in to get a better look at what was inside the shell, bringing the candle with him as he did. Saruman saw what he about to do and stopped him by gripping the arm holding the candle. He got the silent warning and promptly stepped away. If the wall is breached, Helm's Deep will fall, he said, walking out of the workroom. Even if it is breached, it would take a number beyond reckoning, thousands, to storm the keep, Grima protested as he followed. Tens of thousands, he corrected, walking out onto a balcony. But, my lord, there is no such force, the Wormtongue told him as he followed. When he stepped out of the tower and into the open air, he heard a horn sound off and saw a mass horde of Uruk-hai standing before the tower. When they saw their master, they began chanting a war cry that sounded suspiciously like tens of thousands. Saruman raised his hand and they quieted down. A new power is rising. Its victory is at hand, he told them, making the horde roar with bloodlust, until he raised his hand again. This night, the land will be stained with the blood of Rohan. March to Helm's Deep. Leave none alive. To war! He commanded, rising his arms into the air. That command sent the Uruk-hai into a rage, roaring and bellowing their cruel joy at the chance to do what they were bred to do. Grima looked down at the sheer number of Uruk-hai shouting and screaming, waving their tall pikes in the air. A tear escaped his eye, showing that at some level of his being, he had cared for Rohan, once. But Saruman had none of that care. There will be no dawn for men, he declared as he looked on. Chapter 17, The Preparation. Location: Fangorn. Treebeard was walking slowly through the forest with Pippin and Merry riding on what could be described as his shoulders and Izuna walking beside him. The half-elf had, for lack of a better description, ridden the Ent from time to time, but preferred to have his feet on the ground. What he didn't tell the others that it was only as he walked that he saw some brief glimpse of a person in the forest, and he wanted to know more. He didn't go far from Treebeard, but he would try to go after the glimpse. The problem was that it kept disappearing on him. So when he didn't see the glimpses and they were bored, he would play a game he had learned from the hobbits. I spy with my little eye something that is brown, tall and wooden, Pippin said since it was his turn. Merry looked at him with a look of annoyance. You've just described the entire forest surrounding us, Pip. Give us more to work with. All right, it's also naughty and leans a bit. Again, you've just described the entire. He's talking about the tree to our right and about 10 feet behind us, Izuna answered as he kept walking. It leans to the right, and the base of it has knots in it. That's right, Pippin said, unsurprised that he got it. Aside from getting a few false ones at the beginning of their game, the half-elf had gotten every single one thrown at him. All right, my turn, Merry said, looking around the surrounding forest. Treebeard was going up a hill, giving them a nice view of everything. I spy with my little eye something small, with a coat, and can go very fast. The other two players start looking around for what he had just described. Is it that little bird over there? Pippin asked, pointing at said bird nesting in a forest. No. Then how about that hawk? He pointed upwards to a hawk flying up in the air. It was flying at such a height it looked like it could fit into one of their hands. Nope, not that, Merry said. Honestly, Pip, I said small. I thought you were talking about distance-wise. No, I was talking about size-wise. He was talking about the raccoon in the tree on our left napping on the branch, Izuna told the Took. Merry frowned. You're right, he told Izuna. Are you cheating? It certainly felt like he was cheating. He looked up at the hobbit. How could I be cheating at a game I've only just learned? He asked two of them. My turn now, he declared when they didn't have an answer. Look, Pippin said suddenly as they reached the top of the hill. There's smoke to the south. He sounded so serious that Izuna quickly forgot about the game. Despite seeing the smoke, Treebeard didn't seem to be that worried about it. There is always smoke rising from Isengard these days, he told them. Isengard? Repeated Merry, surprised to hear that word. He had no idea they were close to Saruman's stronghold. Both he and Pippin climbed up higher on Treebeard to get a closer look. Izuna, having heard both of them speak, quickly joined them and stood on Treebeard's other shoulder. There was a time when Saruman would walk in my woods, the Ent told them as they climbed. But now he has a mind of metal and wheels. He no longer cares for growing things. Once they had proper sight of Isengard, the three of them could also see what was leaving Isengard. What is it? Pippin asked as he looked on at the thick, black column stretching out from Isengard to the horizon. It's Saruman's army, Mary said, realizing what that meant. The war has started. All three of them shared looks with one another. The army of the former White Wizard was marching and there was nothing they could do. Location: Helm's Deep. Sasuke walked through the camp made behind the deeping wall. They were waiting for news to come. Whether it would be about what Saruman had done or what aid may come to them, they did not know. All they could do was wait. But even as they waited, Sasuke still could find things to do. He had sharpened the edge of the katana, had helped with the moving of supplies into the caves, where he had seen Gimli become awestruck by what he saw there, and now he was trying to find a place in the camp to sit down and rest for a few moments. Sasuke, he heard Boromir say as he passed the man from Gondor. He turned to look at the man. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the deeping wall. I had thought that you would be helping, he commented. I was. But I tired and now I am resting. I can see. But it wasn't just that. He could see the sweat on Boromir's forehead, the paleness of his skin, and how out of breath he sounded. Something was happening with him, but it was not the shinobi's place to pry. By the way, have you seen Legolas anywhere? I have not seen him. He looked up at the deeping wall and then at the Hornburg, finally spotting the elf standing over the gate. He's keeping watch. Oh, that's good. Seeing that there was nothing else left to say, the raven-haired shinobi moved on away from him. As he walked through the camp, he did not make eye contact with any of the refugees and they didn't try either. Even those who were from Edoras were weary of this stranger who had saved their children, but kept to himself. Even as he walked, his hood was up over his head and his cloak hid what clothes he wore. He did not pay attention to the not staring he was getting from, he just walked past them. But when he was about to sit down, the boy who rode to Edoras came to him. Bellman, he said in greeting. What? He asked shortly. Have you eaten? No. The boy did something unexpected. He grabbed the shinobi's hand and started pulling him along. Come on then. Completely surprised by the action, Sasuke let himself be dragged along by the boy. Everyone nearby looked on as the stranger be pulled along by the boy. They started talking amongst themselves, wondering what was going on. Mama, I found him, the boy said as he finally stopped walking, coming before a small fire that had his sister, and obviously his mother sitting around it. Eothane, what are you doing? His mother demanded when she saw the sight in front of her. Why do you have the bellman with you? His sister asked. I brought him so he could eat with us, Eothane answered both of them, like that answer was enough to satisfy them. It wasn't. Young man, I raised you better than that. His mother scolded him. He winced at the chastisement thrown at him. Deciding to be a saving grace, Sasuke decided to intervene. It's all right, he told her, removing his hood. I am hungry. Oh. There was a moment of awkward silence before she spoke again. Then please sit. He sat down at the fire, taking note of the large piece of meat roasting on the fire. When it was cooked enough, the mother carved off pieces and gave them to her children and to her guest. Thank you, Sasuke said to her, taking the plate from her. He pulled out a kunai and began cutting it up. They ate in silence for a moment, filling their stomachs because it was needed. 3 of them were too sacred of what was happening to enjoy food for what it was. By the time they were halfway through their meal, the conversation started up again. Bellman, do you have an actual name? The girl asked him. Frida, manners. The mother scolded her. But I just wanted to know, she protested. She looked over at him. Could you tell me, please? I'm sorry, my lord, her mother told him. I have raised my children better than this. There is no need to worry, I am not offended, he said. And I am not a lord. I'm just a wanderer. I remember. He looked at her, a little curious to see what that meant. Have we met before? He asked. Both her son and her daughter looked at her with surprise. Mama, you met the bellman before? Eothane asked her. It was when you were a babe and Frida was resting beneath my heart, she told both him and their guest. He came into our village and stayed for the night. He was given lodgings, but kept to himself. But the next morning, when the sun had not yet risen, a band of orcs attacked the village. If it had not been for him, the sounds of battle would never have reached our ears and the men would not have rushed out to help him, driving the orcs away. We tried to thank and reward him, but he didn't take anything. He just left. I thought it would have been the best time to do so, Sasuke said, finally remembering that particular time. And anyone would have done the same, no thanks was needed. We had disagreed, but you had already left, she replied. I meant no offense, he told her after a moment of silence. And you gave none. Are you from Gondor? Eothane asked him, his curiosity burning bright at the chance for more knowledge of the stranger. He looked at the boy, saw the curiosity on his face, and seeing himself in him, indulged him. No, I am not from Gondor. I am not even from Middle-earth. That surprised all three of them. Clearly, they had thought him to be from somewhere in Middle-earth. Where did you come from then? Asked Frida. I come from a land that is to the south. It has its own name in my native tongue, but here I have called it Southern Earth. My lord! My lord! Shouted a guardsman as he came running through the camp towards their fire. When he finally stopped, he was panting hard. What is it? Sasuke said to him, ignoring the fact that he was called a lord again. The only way he could be called that was if he formally became the head of the Uchiha clan. You must come with me, my lord, he said. Lord Aragorn has been sighted. He's coming into the Hornburg as we speak. A silent wave of relief swept through him at that news. While he had been afraid that the ranger was dead like the rest of his group, he didn't show it, just like he didn't show his relief now. I see, thank you, he said before going back to his food. The guard was surprised by his reaction. My lord, will you not come right now? I will meet with Aragorn when I have finished the meal this nice family has given me. I will not be so rude to them as to leave before finishing it, he said shortly. Of course, my lord, the guardsman said. Thank you for saying that, Eothane and Frida's mother said to him as the guardsman left. It is not any trouble, madam, he replied. What he kept to himself was that he enjoyed talking to the three of them, especially Frida and Eothane. They reminded him of himself when he had been a kid. As it turned out, Aragorn had lived through his fall to the river and was found by the horse he had asked to be freed in Edora's, Brego. He rode that horse to Helm's Deep, where the people looked at him with awe. As he dismounted from Brego, an angry dwarf voice filled the air. Where is he? Where is he? Get out of the way! I'm going to kill him! Gimli pushed through the crowds and stood before the ranger. You are the luckiest, the canniest, and the most reckless man I ever knew. He went for the hug, which Aragorn did not stop. Bless you, laddie. After taking the hug in, Aragorn pushed him back enough so they could speak. Gimli, where is the king? He asked. The dwarf nodded to the hall at the top of the stairs. He nodded once and went up the stairs at a quick rate, belting on his sword as he went. Just as he was about to reach the doors to the hall, Legolas and Boromir stood before him. Abdallan, you're late, Legolas told him before looking over him. You look terrible. He'll be fine, Boromir said. It's not like he fell into a river from a great height. All three of them cracked a grin at those words, happy to see each other again. Eowyn was nearby, helping some of the refugees, when she saw Aragorn standing there. She began walking quickly over to him, only to stop when she saw Legolas give him something. She realized that it was the jewel he worn on the path to Helm's Deep. Hananlu, thank you, she heard the ranger say to the walked away, knowing what she might say to him would never do. As Aragorn walked past Legolas and Boromir and went for the doors, he saw Sasuke standing by them. Nice to see you're still alive, the shinobi said simply. It might not have been much, but the ranger could hear the silent relief in those words. Thank you? The king is inside, I hope? I have news that he will need to hear. Sasuke didn't say anything. He simply went for the doors and pushed them open. Theoden King, Aragorn is here, he declared for the hall to hear. The king of Rohan looked on from his throne with his guards by his side as Aragorn entered the hall. Theoden King, I have news that must be shared, he said. Those who need to hear this news stay. Otherwise, clear the hall, Theoden declared. Those who weren't needed there left just as quickly as those who were needed coming in, including Legolas, Boromir, and Gimli. The Lord of the Mark stood from his throne and began walking through the hall as he heard Aragorn's news. A great host, you say? He repeated what he heard. All Isengard is emptied, Aragorn told him. He had seen it as he rode Brego to Helm's Deep. How many? He asked. 10,000 strong at least, the ranger told him. The king went still as he heard those words. 10,000? He asked, turning back to look at him. Aragorn nodded briefly. What he had seen of the Uruk-hai had been like a black horde marching towards Helm's Deep. It is an army bred for a single purpose, to destroy the world of men, he declared. They will be here by nightfall. Theoden was silent as he looked at all the people in the hall. Finally, he turned his head and went for the doors. Let them come! What is the king thinking? Sasuke and the other members of the fellowship there thought as they followed him. As he began to walk down the Hornburg, Theoden gave his order to Gimli. I want every man and strong lad, able to bear arms, to be ready for battle by nightfall. The guardsmen nodded and went off. The king and the fellowship stepped outside the gate and looked at what was around them. We will cover the causeway and the gate from above. No army has ever breached the Deeping Wall, or set foot inside the Hornburg. This is no rabble of mindless orcs, Gimli told him from where he stood before the gate, his hands resting on his axe. These are Uruk-hai. Their armor is thick and their shields broad. The king went straight up to him. I have fought many wars, Master Dwarf, he replied, evenly and yet warningly. I know how to defend my own keep. He walked back into said keep, passing an annoyed dwarf, who got a reassuring hand from Aragorn. As they climbed up to the inner ramparts, Theoden told them what he thought would happen. They will break upon this fortress like water on rock. Saruman's hordes will pillage and burn. We've seen it before. Crops can be resown, homes rebuilt. Within these walls, we will outlast them. They do not come to destroy Rohan's crops or villages. They come to destroy its people, down to the last child, Aragorn told him. But he had said it in front of some guards, so Theoden took his arm and pulled him in. What would you have me do? He asked with a whisper, quiet enough to keep it private but loud for the other fellowship members to hear. Look at my men. Their courage hangs by a thread. If this is to be our end, then I would have them make such an end, as to be worthy of remembrance. He turned around and started walking away. Send out riders, my lord, the ranger told him, making him stop. You must call for aid. And who will come? He challenged, coming back. Elves? Dwarves? Strangers from a different land? We are not so lucky in our friends as you. The old alliances are dead. Boromir had an answer for him, having heard everything. Gondor will answer Theoden king, he said. The oath of yore will be upheld by my father. But if that was supposed to make the king happy, it didn't work. Gondor? Repeated Theoden, turning his head to look at the captain general. Where was Gondor when the Westfold fell? Where was Gondor when our enemies closed in around us? Where was gone? He stopped himself from continuing, lest he say something he would regret. No, my lord Aragorn, my lord Boromir, we are alone. Sasuke stared directly at him. He could see that the man was committed to this fate that was to come upon them. Nothing will convince him otherwise now, he thought to himself. Theoden walked away from the fellowship, down the ramparts, and then to the hall. Get the women and children into the caves, he ordered Gimli, who had fallen in behind him. We need more time to lay provisions, Gimli began to say. There is no time, the king cut him off. War is upon us. That ended the argument. Secure the gate, Gimli told a pair of nearby guardsmen, who did as they were ordered. No one noticed the flock of Creebane in the air overlooking the valley. Location: Fangorn. We Ents have not troubled about the wars of men and wizards for a very long time, Treebeard told the hobbits and the half-elf as they kept walking through the forest. But ahead of them was a light that could only belong to the open sky. But now, something is about to happen that has not happened for an age. He walked out of the trees and into the clearing. And moot, he declared. They looked around the clearing and only saw a large slab of rock pointing upwards into the air at an angle. What's that? Mary asked him, talking about the moot. 'Tis a gathering, he answered. A gathering of what? Asked the hobbit. The forest all around them moaned, groaned, and stirred to his question. As he listened to the forest, Izuna knew the answer. A gathering of Fangorn, he said. As if to answer his words, other Ents began to come out of the forest and into the clearing. They all had different appearances, and they came at their own pace. Beech, oak, chestnut, ash. Good, good, good. Many have come, Treebeard said as he looked at his fellow Ents. Now we must decide if the Ents will go to war. Location, Helm's Deep. The guards were already taking what men and boys they could find to take them to the armory to be suited for war. The others who weren't being taken, the women and children who were too young, were heading into the caves for safety. Aragorn was walking against the flow of the people going into the cave. We'll place the reserves along the wall. They can support the archers from above the gate, he said to Legolas and Boromir, who were following him. He saw that Sasuke was nearby, guiding people into the caves. Aragorn, you must rest, Legolas told him. You're no use to us half alive. We do not have time to rest, he replied. Then you must make time, Boromir said to him, agreeing with Legolas. My lord! Aragorn! Called out Eowyn as she came towards him. I'm to be sent with the women into the caves, she told him. Already he could tell that was not what she wanted. But he could not speak against Theoden's orders. That is an honorable charge, he told her. To mind the children, to find food and bedding when the men return, she protested. What renown is there in that? My lady, a time may come for valor without renown. Who then will your people look to in the last defense? He asked her. She knew the answer, but did not want to hear it. Let me stand at your side. It is not in my power to command it. He turned to go back to his duties. You do not command the others to stay, she said to him, making him stop and turn back to her. They fight beside you because they would not be parted from you. Because they love you, she declared. In the silence that followed, they stared at each other. Finally, she bowed her head and looked away. I'm sorry. She walked away from him, following the crowd. Even as the people of Rohan went into the caves and began finding places to settle, the men who were young enough and the boys who were old enough were taken by the guards to be fitted for the coming fight. Their wives and mothers cried as they watched them be taken away. They knew that it had to happen, but they didn't have to like it. Eowyn tied back her hair. She may want to be in the upcoming fight, but she was here and she would do what was asked of her. The men and boys who were conscripted into fighting were taken to the armory to be given armor and weapons. Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Boromir stood in the middle of the room, looking at the people in there and at the weapons. Farmers, farriers, stable boys. These are no soldiers, Aragorn declared. That may be, but they are all we have left, Boromir said to him. That does not make it right, Boromir, Gimli told him. Most have seen too many winters. Or too few, Legolas added as he scanned the room. Look at them. They're frightened. I can see it in their eyes. His statement made the entire room stop and look at him. Boa Hwyn, Nelaid Hurain Dan Caermanig, and they should be 300 against 10,000? He asked in Sindarin to Aragorn. Sibiriathar Hwyn Amiag na Nedadoras, they have more hope of defending themselves here than at Edoras, the ranger answered in the same tongue. Aragorn, Nedan Dager Hen Uarir Orthari, he replied. Nath the Dage Dare, Aragorn, they cannot win this fight. They are all going to die. Then I shall die as one of them. The ranger shouted, switching back to the common tongue. The two of them glared at each other, and then the man turned to walk away. Legolas moved to go after him, only to have Gimli stop him. Let him go, lad, the dwarf said. Let him be. Location, Fangorn. Night had fallen since the Moot had convened and the Ents were still standing around the rock. They were not speaking words that the other people there could understand. All they could hear was the moaning and groaning one would expect from trees. Pippin had tried to get some sleep and he had fallen asleep a few hours back. But a loud groan had woken him up and he saw Merry pacing the ground. It's been going for hours, the brandybuck told him. They have something quite serious to talk about, Izuna said from where he stood next to a tree. Perhaps they have a lot of things to decide. They must have decided something by now, Pippin said in reply, standing up from where he was sleeping. Decided? Treebeard repeated, having heard the two of them. He turned around to look at them. No. We only just finished saying, good morning. The hobbits and half-elves stared at him for a long second. I stand corrected, Izuna said. But it's night time already, Mary said to Treebeard, annoyed at his attitude. You can't take forever. Don't be hasty, the Ent told him. We're running out of time. He tried telling them. But the Ent only turned his head back to the Ent moot. Izuna saw another glimpse in the forest. I will be back, he told the two hobbits, going in the direction of the glimpse. When he reached the spot, he saw another glimpse deeper in the forest. He went further in, determined to find who it was that wore red that kept appearing before him. Chapter 18. The Storm Arrives. Location: Helm's Deep. The night had come to Helm's Deep, and torches had been lit to see through the darkness. When the sun had finally disappeared from sight, the men who were conscripted into fighting were abuzz with activity, moving all around to their positions. The strength of the men would be stringed along the walls. It was strained to such a degree that a good enough of a blow would most likely shatter it. Amidst the chaos of people moving in every single direction, there was a sort of tense peace. To those who were not doing anything and were just waiting, they could only watch the others run around. Aragorn was one of those people. He was sitting on the steps that led to the keep. He watched the people going back and forth. He and Legolas were not speaking at the moment. Both Gimli and Boromir were resting, and he had no idea where Sasuke had disappeared to. He noticed a young man, practically a boy, standing nearby over a fire, trying to keep warm. He was wearing a suit of armor that looked loose on him. He held a sword, and his grip said that he was nervous and unsure. He looked at the ranger, and quickly looked away when he was seen. "Give me your sword," Aragorn told him. He did as he was ordered, walking over to the ranger and handing him the sword. "What is your name?" "Haleth, son of Hama, my lord," he answered. That answer made the ranger pause and look at him, finally seeing some of Hama in him. "The men are saying we will not live out the night. They say that it is hopeless." Not saying anything at first, he stood up from where he had been sitting. He held the sword out and looked down its edge. He swung it expertly through the air, feeling how it moved. "This is a good sword," he finally declared, giving the sword back. "Haleth, son of Hama," he said, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "There is always hope." After talking to the boy, Aragorn finally did something about the incoming attack. He prepared himself for battle. He preferred speed when it came to his defense, being able to step out of the way before an attack struck him, which was why he did not go any armor that might have slowed him down. Instead, he stuck to chain mail and added support to it with a leather vest. Once they were both, he reached for his belt and wrapped it around his waist, tightening it just enough to make sure it stayed. When he reached for his sword, he found it missing. But then he saw it behind him, being held by Legolas, who only a pair of shoulder pauldrons for armor. He took it gratefully. "We have trusted you this far. You have not led us astray," Legolas said to him. "Forgive me. I was wrong to despair." "You moadaved, Legolas, there is nothing to forgive, Legolas," he told his friend, giving him a pat on the shoulder, which he got in return. The sound of a grumbling dwarf filled the air in the armory, as Gimli appeared in front of them, alongside Boromir. The Captain General of Minas Tirith wore the same armor as the guards of the king, but with his horn at his side and his shield slung across his back. Gimli, on the other hand, was struggling with a very big shirt of chainmail. "We had time, I'd get this adjusted," he said to them all as he continued to struggle with it. Once he was done, he let it drop and the bottom of the chainmail crashed onto the floor, making a loud noise and easily covering his feet. "It's a little tight across the chest," he said after a moment of silence. The rest of the fellowship in the room shared a smile at those words. "Gimli, perhaps you might want to stay with you are wearing now?" Legolas suggested to him, trying to keep the smile hidden as best he could. The dwarf stared at him and gave him a suspicious glare. "And what would you suggest that I do with this shirt?" Boromir had a suggestion for him. "Throw it at the Uruk-hai when they come attacking and hope it will slow them down," he offered. They might have laughed, or at the very least chuckled, about it had they not heard a horn ring out from the outside. "That is no orc horn," Legolas declared. "A horn that was fashioned by an orc would have sounded a lot more cruder." He ran out of the armory and Aragorn followed. Gimli was stuck in his spot because of the chain mail, but Boromir soon got him out of it. "Thanks for that, lad," the dwarf said to him. Together they went after the elf and ranger. As the horn rang out into the night sky, the soldiers on the ramparts of the Hornburg looked at the causeway, for that was where the horn was being sounded from. "Send for the king," one soldier ordered another, who did as he was ordered. "Open the gate," the first soldier shouted. The order was repeated and the gate was opened to let the host of elven warriors to come marching in, 4 men abreast. All the soldiers of Rohan, both actual and conscripted, could only watch in stunned awe and wonder as the elves passed them. Even though they were cloaked and hooded in cloaks that were the color of night blue, they could see the helmets beneath the hoods and the tall bows that each and every elf carried. Banners came with them, being held high so they could be seen in all their brightly colored glory. Grins and smiles appeared on the faces of the men of Rohan as they watched the elves marched up through the Hornburg. Now they stood a chance against the horde that was marching towards them. But there was still one question that needed to be asked, and it was asked by Theoden when the elves marched before the steps leading to the keep. "How is this possible?" he said, standing in his armor and looking at the elves in his fortress. Haldir, who was the leader of the elves, stood before the king in his own armor, and bowed his head. "I bring word from Elrond of Rivendell," he said, raising his head again. "An alliance once existed between elves and men. Long ago we fought and died together." His eyes saw Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Boromir quickly appearing on the steps. "We come to honor that allegiance." He bowed his head again to Aragorn as the ranger came down the steps to greet him. He was a little surprised to get a hug from him, but he did not push away from it. "You are most welcome," Aragorn told him after stepping away from the hug. Legolas stepped forward and clasped arms with Haldir. The elves, seeing the Prince of Mirkwood, came to attention, first by turning their head, then their bodies before ending by resting the bottom tip of their bows on the ground. "We are proud to fight alongside men once more," Haldir told the king of Rohan. For a moment, Theoden was at a loss for words. But he soon found them. "And we are honored to fight alongside elves once more," he replied. "All right, I'll admit it. That was impressive," Gimli acknowledged as he looked at the elves standing at complete attention. He had never seen an army of dwarves do something like that so smoothly, and without a word spoken. "I thank you for your praise, Master Dwarf," Haldir said to him. His eyes took notice of something else, and he looked further up the steps to see Sasuke standing at the top, his cloak covering the clothes he wore completely. "Krabander, it is good to see you once more." "Haldir," Sasuke greeted the elf as he walked down the steps, reaching the bottom and looking at the elven host that stood before him. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he did. "I know you are there," he said in his native tongue. The people standing around him had no idea what he had just said, but it had done something. 8 hooded people appeared before him from seemingly out of nowhere. One of them stepped forward and pulled down their hood, revealing a man with white hair, purple eyes, and a sharpened smile. "I knew I wouldn't be able to pull one past you, but the others weren't convinced," he said in the language of the elemental nations. "Suigetsu," Sasuke said, looking at him. "Nice to see you too, Sasuke," he greeted the raven-haired shinobi. "How have you been? Why are you here?" "We got a mission a couple of months back, telling us to come here and assist the people in fighting what was coming." His mind instantly went to Indra when he heard those words. So his ancestor had called for help, just not the help he needed, and secretly wanted. The shinobi have never left the elemental nations before for missions, why start now? "Hey, don't ask me, I'm just the leader of this little group. The Mizukage is the one who gave us the mission. We ran into those guys when we were about to find this place, so we just tailed after them," he said, pointing at the elves behind them, who didn't blink an eye. Sasuke looked at the other hooded people standing behind him. "You've done it then?" he asked. "Yeah, I did it," Suigetsu said with a proud grin on his face, realizing what he was talking about. "It was a pain in the ass, but I did it. And now I lead them." "Krabander, who are they?" asked Legolas as he looked at them all. The raven-haired shinobi turned to look at the elf. They are my reinforcements, he answered in the common tongue of Middle-earth. This? Theoden said, looking just as well as the elf. The elves have sent a host, and you have sent for 8 people? His voice was full of disbelief. Oi, what did he say? Suigetsu asked Sasuke. He didn't understand what the blonde guy in armor was saying, but he could tell it wasn't something good. Crabender was silent for a moment, looking between the two groups slowly. He doesn't believe you will be of any worth, he finally said to the Kiri shinobi. Is that so? Yes. He turned his head to look at the 6 who stood before him. The 7th stood just a few inches apart, enough to show that he wasn't one of them. Draw swords, he ordered in a loud voice. Their cloaks flapped open, making their hoods fall down to reveal their faces, as they drew out the swords that marked them and held them out for all who were there to see. The soldiers of Rohan drew back in surprise at the sudden sight of weapons being revealed. Thinking that they were already being attacked, some of them went for their swords. Stay your blades, Theoden instantly bellowed when he saw what they were doing. They did as they were told, and he looked at Sasuke. What is the meaning of this? These 7 are not just any shinobi, he told the Lord of the Mark. They are the 7 shinobi swordsmen of the mist, the best of Kirigakure, one of the 5 great shinobi countries. The only one who is better than they is their leader, the Mizukage. The swords they wield pick their wielders, which alone should show how difficult it is to become a part of their group. Saruman needs 10,000 Urkai to try and take this fortress. They would only need themselves to take it. He fell silent and looked at all the people who were there and listening to him before turning his attention back to the king. Is there anything else I need to convince you of? Theoden looked at him, then at the 8, and then back at him. If there are 7 swordsmen, who is the 8th? He asked. Seeing his point, and not saying anything in response, Sasuke turned back around to look at the 8th person standing there. His hood was still up, hiding enough of his face to make him unrecognizable. But he could see the raven-haired shinobi staring at him. He walked forward, making the Kiri shinobi step away and lower their swords, coming to stand before Sasuke. The difference in height was that the raven-haired shinobi had to look up at him. He was by no means a giant, but he was taller than Sasuke. He reached up and pulled his hood down, revealing his orange hair, beard, and eyes that also had a tint of red to them. Before anyone could do anything, they were all surprised when he suddenly went down on one knee, placing his opposite fist on the stone floor of the keep. The only exception was Suigetsu, who had been expecting it. Sasuke, he said, his head bowed. You go, Sasuke said in reply. Stand up, you do not bow to me. He did as he was asked, and the two of them looked at one another again. You've grown a beard. I wanted to see what it felt like. Without the razor, I see. The beard he was looking at could very well be called a bush. It was tangled and messy, yet it did not fall past the bottom of his neck. That meant he wasn't living with anyone again but still managed to care for it somehow. No, just a pair of scissors, Yugo said to him. That explains that, he thought to himself. Who is he? Boromir asked him. Was he your servant? He looked over at the man from Gondor. No, he was not. He is a friend. He was a little reluctant to use that word, but it described Yugo to a good enough degree. He was a friend. We must focus on what is important right now, he declared, changing the subject. We have reinforcements. We should use them accordingly for the battle ahead. And are you ready for the battle ahead, Lord Sasuke? Theoden asked him. He didn't look prepared, but the king had figured to never assume with this man. His only response was to reach to the clasp holding his cloak, revealing a gloved hand that shined in the light of the torches. The clasp was undone and the cloak fell to the ground, revealing what he wore beneath. The people surrounding him, including the elves, breathed out a gasp of surprise and wonder at the sight. The other members of the fellowship stared at him in surprise. They knew the suit of armor he wore. That is the armor Balin and the dwarves of Moria crafted, Gimli said. It was made for an uchiha should wear it for the battle, Sasuke said in reply. He wore it well. While the armor of the Rohan soldiers looked poor compared to the armor of the elves, the mithril armor held its own against them. Carried in his arm was a helmet unlike they ever had seen. The sword he always had was attached to a belt around his waist. Each piece of it looked they had been crafted for him exactly. The light of the torches shined against the armor and made it gleam. He seemed more like a warrior prince from a legend than a stranger from lands unknown. And I am prepared. Then let us begin our defenses, Theoden declared. He went into the keep and Aragorn went with him. Halder followed along with Sasuke and Suigetsu. The elves and the other 7 from Southern Earth stayed where they stood, waiting for orders. In the silence, Boromir turned to the only dwarf there and asked one question with a completely straight face. Should we expect a company of dwarves soon, Gimli? Gimli just scowled at him. Now that they had the elves and the shinobi, the defenses of Helm's Deep could be rearranged into much more stronger lines. The elves were placed along the deeping wall and behind it since it was most likely that the Uruks would try to get to the Hornburg through it. The 7 swordsmen were scattered all around the fortress. Some were by the gate, some were on the wall, and some were behind it, all placed where they were best suited. Hugo was not a part of the battle, having been asked to go to the caves to protect the children by Sasuke, who explained it to Eowyn when they had arrived. Now all they could do was wait, and they did not have to wait long. Already they could see the torches marching towards them and hear their footsteps pounding on the ground. But their ears were mostly filled by the silence, and it made them tense. Legolas and Gimli, along with Sasuke and Suigetsu, stood on the deeping wall alongside the elves. But while 3 of them could see what was coming, 1 could not. You lot could have picked a better spot, Gimli grumbled, making Legolas smile a little. The sound of footsteps walking on the stone floor of the wall was heard coming towards. Sasuke turned his head to see the ranger coming towards them. Aragorn, he said in greeting. Sasuke, Aragorn greeted in return. He took note of the fact that while he still carried the helmet, the raven-haired shinobi now wore some kind of mask that protected the upper part of his face, but left his lower half free to move. Well, lad, whatever luck you live by, let's hope it lasts the night, Gimli told Aragorn. Lightning flashed and thunder boomed overhead from the darkened clouds that engulfed the sky. Your friends are with you, Aragorn, Legolas said to the ranger. Let's hope they last the night, Gimli said to himself. What are they saying? Suigetsu asked Sasuke. They're praying, he answered as Aragorn walked away to continue his walk along the deeping wall. Thunder boomed once more and the lightning flashed again. From above, rain began to fall. It was slow but soon fell much more rapidly, and quickly became a shower. And all the while, the Uruk-hai marched closer. Sasuke lifted his head to look at the rain and the storm. Then he took note of the mountains on either side of the fortress, and the valley below them. He could very well use the storm to call forth Kirin and send it smashing into the Uruk-hai horde, but therein lay the problem. The valley was roughly the same size of the Uchiha hideout where he fought Itachi for the last time at the base. He had utterly destroyed the base when he called forth Kirin, and the same could happen here, taking Helm's Deep along with it. There was also a good chance that it could cause an avalanche. Seeing as there were no good options with that jutsu, he wouldn't be able to use it. As the Uruk-hai came closer and closer, Aragorn walked amongst the elves. Aerican, Udano I Phalos Hyn, and Yuban Tanla Lo Phalos, show them no mercy, for you shall receive none, he told them in Sindarin. The leader of the Uruk-hai, who had climbed atop a large rock so he could see the fortress and his own troops, raised his sword and roared at the horde of Uruk-hai. They knew that was an order and came to a complete stop. Now the first line of Uruk-hai stood within easy sight of the deeping wall. Both sides could see the other, with the exception of one person. What's happening out there? Gimli demanded as he tried hopping up and down to get a better look over the wall. Shall I describe it to you? Legolas asked him, making him stop and look up. Or would you like me to find you a box? Gimli could see the humor in the words and began to chuckle at them. The leader of the horde raised his sword and roared once more. The Uruk-hai began to bang their pikes into the ground, making a loud drumming sound. Aragorn, who had stepped forward before the elves, drew his sword and waited. The men of Rohan who manned the ramparts of the Hornburg raised their bows and knocked their arrows. But that did not stop the Uruk-hai, nor did it worry them. They kept banging their pikes into the ground as well as bashing their fists against their chests. It soon became obvious that they were chanting a war chant, hoping to terrorize the people hiding in the fortress, to make the fight easier. The sounds they were making carried deep into the mountains, into the very caves where the women and children were waiting. The chanting and banging continued, as well as the hope of demoralizing the men in Helm's Deep. But what came next could be best described as a quite literal slip of the hand. One of the archers on the outer wall of the Hornburg was an old man, and while he could knock an arrow to a bow and hold it, he could not hold it for long. His arms began to shake, and when he tried to relax them a little, his hand slipped and fired the arrow. It sailed through the raining air and struck one of the Uruk-hai in the first line, pricing its neck and killing it instantly. "Dartho, hold!" Aragorn immediately shouted, preventing anyone else from firing. As the now dead Uruk fell to the earth, Suigetsu spoke. "Well, that's one down, 9,999 to go." Then he noticed Sasuke's look. It had to be said. "No, it didn't," Sasuke replied. Theoden, seeing the Uruk-hai fall to the earth, saw an opportunity. "Lord Boromir!" He called out to the man from Gondor, who was standing at the part of the fortress that connected to the deeping wall, allowing him to move between both places. "Give them a reply." Boromir knew what he meant and reached for his horn. "Let my strength stay with me through this battle," he silently prayed before he blew the horn of Gondor. Its sharp, clear note pierced the night and the rain, sending chills down the backs of the Uruk-hai. But as the horn's note died away, the Uruk-hai started to growl and snarl, their anger and hatred bred into them spiking, causing what passed for blood in their veins to start singing. The growling and snarling quickly turned into screaming and yelling. The leader saw that they were pulling at the chain. So he dropped it by raising his sword and roaring at them to charge forward. As Thodin watched the first line of Uruk-hai charge, he had only one thing to say. "So it begins." The Uruks were charging towards the deeping wall, which meant they were going to attack the elves. "Tangadua Cha'adad, prepare to fire," ordered Aragorn. His order was repeated down the wall, and the elves drew their arrows and knocked them to their bows. Sasuke placed the helmet on his head and strapped it on. Now, he was ready for battle, and he cut an intimidating figure. "Fag Ivarv de Nalank a new rank, their armor is weak at the neck and beneath the arm," Legolas said to the elves surrounding him, letting them know where to fire their arrows. "Lethio I fill in, release the arrows," Aragorn shouted, lowering his hand. At the command and the lowering of the hand, the elves on the wall fired their arrows. They flew through the rain and struck many of the Uruks, sending them to the ground. The elves didn't stop there. They knocked another arrow, drew the bowstring back, and loosed again. Gimli could see the arrows being drawn and loose, and he knew that the elves were shooting at the Uruks, but that was all he knew. "Did they hit anything?" he asked Legolas, but the elf was too busy shooting arrows. So he looked to Sasuke. "Yes," the shinobi told him. Theoden saw the arrows fly from the deeping wall and killed the charging Uruk-hai. "Give them a volley," he ordered Gamling. His guardsman raised his hand. "Fire!" He bellowed out the order, lowering his hand. His order was repeated by a man missing an eye, and the outer ramparts fired off their own round of arrows, killing more Uruks. They kept charging, despite many of their fellow Uruks already being shot down. Aragorn saw that more arrows would be needed, and so signaled the elves standing behind the wall with his sword. "Rib Bant, full volley!" he shouted at them, swinging his sword forward. The arrows flew overhead and fell upon the Uruk-hai, but still they came. Gimli was getting excited. He knew that the Uruks would be close now. "Send them to me. Come on!" he shouted. "Man, this guy is excitable," Suigetsu remarked. Sasuke didn't reply. He was too busy focusing on the incoming enemy. Uruks with crossbows had gotten close enough to fire on the elves. The result was deadly. The armor the elves wore was probably some of the best that had ever been crafted. But it was also archaic, and the bolts being fired from the crossbows had tips of steel, able to pierce the elven armor. The bolts found their targets, and elves did fall from the battlements dead to the ground below. But those who were still alive still fired off arrows at the Uruks. But while this exchange of arrows and bolts went on, the Uruks reached the base of the wall and brought several things with them. "Pendraith, ladders!" Aragorn shouted, realizing that they were indeed ladders and were already being set up by the Uruk-hai. Gimli did not know a lot of Elvish, but what he heard the ranger say was one of those few words. "Good," he declared, readying his axe. The bases of the ladders were placed at the bottom of the deeping wall, and were being raised up with uruks at their tops. "Swords! Swords!" shouted Aragorn to the elves on the wall. They dropped their bows and drew the swords they carried on their backs. Sasuke drew his and Suigetsu did the same as he signaled the wielder of Kabutawari to do the same. The first of the ladders, and the Uruk at its top, was met by Gimli and his axe. But that was only one. More appeared in sight of the elves, and the Uruks riding them carried large swords and no armor, save for a helmet. They swung their swords in a rage-like attack. That, along with its wider reach, killed the elves trying to get close to the Uruk. The enraged Uruks had only one job, and that was to protect the ladders and allow more to climb up onto the deeping wall. It worked to extent. Despite the range of their swords and the fury they swung them with, there was no real skill to it. Sasuke was able to dissect one in half with his katana and his Sharingan. Suigetsu and his fellow swordsmen didn't have that luxury, but that didn't slow them down when it came to killing the Uruk-hai. This isn't too hard, Suigetsu thought to himself. He said too because of the fact that more of them kept coming. But he didn't have a problem with that. It just meant there was more kills for Kubikirabocho. Gimli took notice of a particular enraged Uruk that killing a good number of elves. With a shout, he slid underneath the Uruk and swung his axe into its stomach, killing it. "Legolas!" he called out as he stood back up. "Two already," he said, holding up 2 fingers. "I'm on 17. Legolas replied after knocking an Uruk down to the ground with his bow. The dwarf was not happy to hear those words. "I'll have no pointier outscoring me," he declared, swinging his axe at an Uruk coming up a ladder, and landing it in its crotch, killing the creature. The elf fired 2 arrows at Uruks coming up the ladders. 19, he told Gimli. Sasuke restrained the urge to roll his eyes as he listened to the 2 of them talk like that. It was not the place or time to roll his eyes. He had to focus his attention on the Uruk-hai. And that was what he did. Those who went against him barely saw the katana move through the air before they died. There was also the fact that, to the Uruk-hai, he looked like a creature they would be frightened of, and considering Saruman had tried to breed fear out of them, that was saying something. They could not see his face, so they could not see if there was fear in his eyes or not. All they saw was a mask beneath a great horned helmet. The horns curved towards the sky and could most likely be used to gore them if he wanted to use them like that. The armor he wore was some of the hardest stuff they had ever tried swinging a sword at, yet he was able to move like he was wearing nothing at all. His blade was not the only weapon he used. Several Uruks found themselves dead from knives in their throats, or eyes, as well as from kicks and punches that could cave in someone's face. But what was the most terrifying thing for them were the eyes. Even though they could not see the eyes perfectly, they could see enough of them to know that they were not normal man eyes. Man eyes were not supposed to be red, and they were not supposed to be glowing faintly against the darkness and the rain. As he cut through the Uruks on the deeping wall, Sasuke began to make it a priority to kill the enraged Uruks. They were the ones guarding the ladders, and once they were dead, it would be a lot easier to rid themselves of the ladders. After slicing one of the enraged Uruk's neck open, he found himself back to back with Suigetsu. "Are you having as much fun as I am?" Suigetsu asked him in their native tongue and with a manic grin on his face. "Focus on the fight," Sasuke said to him shortly while deflecting a sword strike from an Uruk and beheading it in the next second. "I am." "Then start kicking those ladders down." "You haven't changed one bit, Sasuke," the wielder of Kubikirabocho told him. But he did as he was told, signaling the wielder of Kabutawari to do the same. Together, the 2 of them began knocking down ladders on the army of Uruk-hai below them, crushing a few in the process. But still more ladders latched themselves onto the deeping wall, and more Uruks climbed up them. Location: Fangorn. He could barely keep sight of the glimpse as he went after it in the forest. It also didn't help that even with his Sharingan, it was still dark enough beneath the branches and leaves from the trees of Fangorn to make him slow down and watch his step. But that didn't stop him from continuing his chase. He went after the glimpses doggedly, determined to find out who it was. Would he or whoever it is just slow down? He thought to himself as he ducked to avoid a tree branch, only to get another one to the face. "Ow," he said on reflex. He instantly clamped down hard on his mouth, to the point he almost made his tongue bleed. But his shout now echoed throughout the surrounding forest. Inwardly, he began cursing himself for the slip. Sasuke-sensei taught you better than that. Sasuke really had taught him better than that. During their training in Lothlorien, brief as it may have been, the half-elf was still unsure of the times his teacher had been able to either sneak up on him or hear him coming. He had tried to learn as best he could, but then he went and did something like that. It was quite pathetic. But even as he chastised himself, his eyes and his gaze were sharp. They kept searching the surrounding area of any slightest glimpse. When he saw, he was going after just as quickly as he had started chastising himself. "How fast can this person be if he outrun me?" he asked as he ran after the glimpse, using every little bit of training he had gotten from Sasuke to chase the glimpse. His natural speed, since he was a half-elf, was better than a normal man but not as good as a full-blooded elf. But he had been trained by Sasuke, it was better. Not as good as a full-blooded elf, but better. But right now, better wasn't good enough. For no matter how much he put into going after the glimpse, it would stay just out of sight and reach. Which was why when he came upon a clearing in the forest, there wasn't another glimpse waiting to be followed. Instead, there was a person standing there with his back turned to Izuna. The half-elf stopped himself from going straight out into the clearing. Instead, he hung back and observed the person standing there in the clearing. He wore armor, but it wasn't like any armor Izuna had seen before. It didn't cover the whole body, just the areas that needed protection, while also keeping him able to move freely. From the way his shoulders were positioned, Izuna could tell that he was crossing his arms. What covered his feet were not boots, but some kind of shoe at the very least. Despite being able to see all that, the half-elf still did not know who the person standing there was. It was only when the person moved slightly, causing his hair to shift, that he saw the sigil on the back of the armor. "That's Sasuke-sensei's clan sigil," he thought to himself as he looked at what he could see of the sigil. But to his very little knowledge, he had thought that he and his sensei were the only uchihas left alive. But perhaps his sensei had been wrong. Maybe they weren't the only uchihas left in the world. "Excuse me," he called out to the stranger's back, trying to get his attention. It worked, and the stranger began to turn around. But as he did, he began to morph into something different. What armor it wore vanished and was replaced with black cloth. Izuna didn't see his face because it had disappeared beneath the shadow created from the hood he now wore. Standing in the place of the would-be Uchiha was a Nazgul, or to be more specific, the Tainted. To Izuna, it had felt like his heart had stopped when he saw the ringwraith that had haunted him for the longest time. Fear took a hold of him, and he stumbled back, falling to the ground. "No," he whispered to himself. It was a word full of fear, pain, and utter terror. The Tainted started making its way towards him, and he scrambled backwards, trying to get away from the Nazgul. But it still came towards him. Now, he felt like he was a child again, trying to hide from his nightmare. "Stay away!" he shouted. But the Tainted did not listen to his command. It came towards him, getting closer with each step. He kept scrambling backwards until he hit the trunk of a tree. And still, the Tainted came closer. Thinking of no better alternatives, the half-elf reached for his wrist and channeled his chakra into the seal. Aglows appeared in his hands, and he held onto the glaive like it was his last line to his sanity. The Tainted came even closer, and he closed his eyes, wishing that this wasn't happening to him. He knew that Sasuke had told him to never close his eyes while fighting an enemy, but it was something he just did. To his surprise, when he opened his eyes again, the Tainted was gone. He stood back on his feet to look around, but saw nothing. Where did it go? He asked himself. Was it just his mind playing tricks on him? Or was the Tainted really there, and had just been driven off? As that thought crossed his mind, he looked down at Aglows. "Are you protecting me, grandfather?" He banished that thought almost as soon as it had appeared in his mind. His grandfather was dead. He had been dead for a long time. Izuna only had himself in that moment, and if he was honest, He was ashamed on how he reacted when he saw the tainted. His shame hung over him as he resealed the glaive of his grandfather and followed him as he went back the way he came, trying to find the moot again. He did not know how he found it. He had lost track and sense of direction when following those deceiving glimpses, but somehow, he was able to find the moot again. He saw Treebeard standing over Merry and Pippin and made his way over to them, careful in how he approached. "Well, that's good news," he heard Pippin say. "What's good news?" he asked as he came closer, making them swing their attention to him. "They've decided that we're not orcs." "And what about Saruman?" asked Merry as he looked up at Treebeard. "Have you come to a decision about him?" "Now, don't be hasty, Master Meriadoc," the Ent said to him. "Hasty?" he repeated. "Our friends are out there. They need our help. They cannot fight this war on their own." "War?" the Ent said. "Yes. It affects us all. Tree, root and twig. But you must understand, young hobbit, it takes a long time to say anything in Old Entish, and we never say anything unless it is worth taking a long time to say." As he turned to go back to the moot, Izuna stared at his back and had only one thought. My forebears helped them speak? If they talked any slower, he and the two hobbits would be here for the rest of their lives. He was hoping that it wouldn't come to that. Chapter 19: Fire, Stone, and Water. Location: Helm's Deep. Things were becoming chaotic atop the deeping wall of Helm's Deep. No matter how many ladders Sasuke and the others knocked down, more and more kept propping themselves up against the wall, allowing Uruks to climb up. It was a slow process, but the Uruk-hai were beginning to outnumber the elves on the deeping wall. But Sasuke would not let that happen. If they ended the threat on the wall, that would hamper the chances of victory for the Uruks. That was enough for anyone to keep on fighting. And so he did. He kept on using the katana to dissect, stab, or behead any Uruk he was close enough to and knock down any ladders in the process. As he fought, he saw Gimli standing on the edge of the deeping wall between two ladders and was swinging his axe at each Uruk that came up them. 17. 18. 19. 20. 21. The dwarf chanted each time his axe sent an Uruk falling to the earth. He was quite happy to be up there, until Sasuke pulled him down and sent the two ladders crashing to the ground. "I had a good thing going there, lad," he said, protest. "We are here to repel a besieging army, not a bloody competition," the raven-haired shinobi told him sharply before going back to the battle. Gimli grumbled, but joined him. While the battle on the deeping wall raged on, a large group of Uruk-hai was marching up the causeway to the gate. The front and the top were protected by shields with Saruman's mark on them. It protected them from the defenders above the gate, but it left a glaring hole in their sides. Aragorn saw this from where he stood on the wall and drew attention to it. "Causeway!" he shouted at the elves around him, repeating the word in Sindarin. The elves around him had gone back to using their bows on the Uruks below. When they heard his words, they immediately swung those bows to the causeway, and fired off a volley. Their arrows flew through the rain and hit the Uruks on the edge of the moving shield. Both Sasuke and Suigetsu saw this happen, and the wielder of the Kubikuribocho immediately put his hand to his ear. Of course he and his team brought radios with them, Sasuke thought to himself. No doubt Suigetsu was ordering the wielders of the Shibuki and the Hiramikarii, who were positioned above the gate, to get down there and deal with it. Before they did that, he would add something of his own. His hand became coated in lighting and he heard the familiar cry. "Chidori Samban," he said, swinging his hand and sending the jutsu flying through the air to the causeway. It struck the Uruks, causing more to collapse dead. As all this raged on, the king of Rohan watched from where he stood. "Is this it?" he asked aloud. "Is this all you can conjure, Saruman?" This was no different from when other enemies had tried to take Helm's Deep. Some of them had done better than what he was seeing. The two foreigners were destroying the group on the causeway, shattering the wall of shields they had. But while his attention was on the causeway, something was happening at the bottom of the deeping wall. A couple of Uruks were carrying one of the spiked iron shells Saruman had created for them and were dragging it into the drain at the base of the deeping wall. They set right against the grate within the wall, and then another one was brought in by a different couple of Uruks. The second one was placed atop the first. When the two Uruks ran out of the grate, a path was cleared directly to that grate. One of the enraged Uruks was running at full speed towards it with a blazing torch. Aragorn, Sasuke, and the wielder of the Kabadawari saw the Uruk running. They hadn't seen the shells, but they still didn't like what it might do. "Togo Han Dad, Legolas, bring him down, Legolas!" shouted Aragorn to his friend. Legolas heard him and saw the Uruk with the torch. He knocked an arrow and fired it at the Uruk. It prized the part of the body between the shoulder and the neck, but the Uruk kept running. "Dago Han! Dago Han, kill him! Kill him!" The ranger urged the elf, who fired another arrow. It hit the Uruk, but it still kept running. The wielder of the Kabadawari began flipping his hands through a set of hand seals, preparing a jutsu that might stop the Uruk, when quite possibly, the most weird yet effective thing of that entire siege happened. The torch-bearing Uruk, who had been running at full speed towards, tripped over a loose piece of rock and flew into the grate. What came next would be engraved into the memories of those who saw it for the rest of their lives. The deeping wall exploded. There was no other way to describe it. The explosion tore through the stone with a loud roar and a bright flash of light. It was so loud that even those who were in the caves could hear it. Giant stones and boulders were blown upward into the sky, taking with them elves, Uruks, and the wielder of the Kabadawari, who had been standing in the exact center above the grate. They would later find him dead with no legs, but with his hands still firmly grasping the Kabadawari. Those few who had gotten caught in the blast but were lucky enough to be wounded either fell off the wall or to the sides of, dazed or completely unconscious. Among the survivors were a few of the elves, Aragorn, Sasuke, and Gimli. Out of all of them, Sasuke was the first to regain consciousness. "What happened?" he thought to himself as he got back to his feet. Then he looked and saw the answer right smack in his face was a large hole in the deeping wall. Uruks were already rushing towards it, but were pushed back by the sudden wave of water that fell upon them. Seeing an opportunity, he threw a Chidori Simban at the water and watched in brief satisfaction as the water carried the electricity to the Urkai, frying those who were nearest to the wall. The wielder of the Kiba, who stood behind the wall, saw what he had done and not wanting to just stand there, threw his own lightning jutsu at the water, adding to the effect and killing more Uruks. While it may have been impressive to see, Sasuke only thought of one thing: show off. He turned his attention back to the wall. There were still Uruks climbing up the ladders. He acted quickly by kicking one ladder down with the Uruk on the top still on. Boromir saw the explosion happen and was just as shocked as the rest of the men and elves there. But once the noise died and the dust settled, he saw what had happened. He drew his sword and immediately went down the wall, praying to the Vala that his friends were still alive. Within seconds he was fighting his way through Uruks. As he cut through them, he kept his focus on where his friends were. As this all happened, Theoden's attention fell back to the gate and the causeway beyond. Both of the foreign warriors were fighting off the moving shield, until one of them was struck in the throat with a bolt and fell to the ground dead. The other grabbed his body and his weapon and ran back up the wall, but before getting a bolt to his back. Once the defense was out of the way, a ram broke free of the moving shield, sending the Uruks on the edges off the causeway to their deaths, and was directed at the gate itself. "Brace the gate!" the king shouted, seeing what they were planning to do. Men inside the fortress raced to the gate and pressed their weight against it just as the ram struck. They were thrown back, but pushed against it again. Above the gate, the defenders started raining down rocks and any kind of weapon they could use on the Urkai, with only marginal success. "Hold them! Stand firm!" Theoden told them all. Meanwhile, after the right Unjutsus had stopped, the Urkai began swarming the hole in the deeping wall, emerging on the other side to move forward and attack. Sasuke saw this and he also saw that Aragorn was coming too, but lay in the path of the Uruks. If he did not move, he would be killed. Gimli saw the same thing he did. "Aragorn!" the dwarf cried out, leaping up from he lay on the wall. To the shock of all who saw him, he took a running leap off the wall and into the midst of the Uruks. "Gimli!" shouted Aragorn as he came up to his feet. The dwarf stood up and started fighting off the Uruks around him, only to be knocked down into the water a few seconds later. Hado I fill in, release arrows. The ranger cried to the elves behind him, gesturing with his sword. They fired a volley into the Uruks, slaying many at the front. Hirio, charge! Shouted Aragorn, holding his sword at the ready. The elves who had their swords charged forward, running behind the man who gave the order. The Uruks, having realized what they were doing, pushed forward through the hole in the wall and formed a line of pikes facing the elves. When the two forces met, most of the elves were able to swat aside the pikes and meet the Uruks in direct combat. Some were not quick enough and were impaled. Sasuke soon lost sight of Sujetsu on the wall and saw him again on the ground, pulling Gimli out of the water and then joining the wielders of Nubari, Kiba, and Samahata in the fight. Then he took notice of Boromir fighting alone against the Uruk-hai on the deeping wall. He was about to shout to Legolas to go to his aid when he saw the elf grab a Uruk-hai shield and promptly used it to slide down the nearby staircase, firing off arrows as he went. When he reached the bottom, he leapt off of the shield and joined the fray, using his arrows as well as his knives. The Uchiha didn't join the fight below. He leapt to the other side of the deeping wall and began fighting his way to the Captain General of Gondor. Location: Fangorn. The Enmoot seemed to be done, and Treebeard came back to the hobbits and half-elf. The Ents cannot hold back this storm, he told them. We must weather such things as we have always done. When he heard those words, Merry was enraged. How can that be your decision? He demanded. This is not our war, the Ents said. But you're part of this world. He looked at all the Ents that were there. Aren't you? He asked them all. They shared looks of uncertainty, unsure of what to do. You must help. Please. You must do something. You are young and brave, Master Merry, Treebeard said to him. But your part in this tale is over. Go back to your home. He turned to walk away, only to stop when Izuna spoke. Cowards, the half-elf said, looking up at all the Ents with anger in his eyes. You are all cowards. If my ancestors could see what has become of you now, they would weep at such a sight. But the Ents remained silent and withdrew. Seeing as they were given no other choice, the three non-Ents there had begun to pack their things. Pippin saw how down the other two looked and tried to put some cheer into them. Maybe Treebeard's right, he said to them. We don't belong here, Merry. It's too big for us. What can we do in the end? We've got the Shire and Izuna has Lothlorien. Maybe we should go home. The fires of Isengard will spread, and the woods of Tuckborough and Buckland will burn, Merry said in reply. And he turned to look at his friend. And all that was once green and good in this world will be gone. There won't be a Shire, Pippin. Nor will there be a Lothlorien, Izuna added. For if the enemy wins, I am sure that will be his first target. The two left the Took alone with what they said, for it was grim facts and Pippin needed to think it over. But even as he did, that single thought kept repeating itself. What can we do? Location: Helm's Deep. The battle was not going good. There were only so many elves on the deeping wall and behind it, but there were many more Uruks flooding in over the ladders and through the hole, making the odds more and more uneven. They had even lost the wielder of the Kiba to several Uruk-hai pikes. Theoden could see this happening and made a decision. Aragorn! He shouted down to the ranger. Fall back to the keep. Get your men out of there. The ranger heard his words and could see where the battle was going. Nan Barad! Nan Barad, to the keep! Pull back to the keep! He began ordering the elves around him while still fighting off the Uruk-hai. He looked up and saw Halder still on the wall. Halder, Nan Barad, Halder, to the keep! He shouted to him. Meanwhile, Legolas and another elven warrior dragged an annoyed and struggling Gimli to Are you doing? What are you stopping for? The dwarf demanded as he tried to get free and rejoin the fight. Halder began ushering and urging the elves on his side of the wall to go to the fortress. Nan Barad, to the keep! He called out to them. They began to run past him while he stayed in place, making sure that the rest would get there first. He struck down one Uruk but saw another on the edge of his sight. He turned to strike, but saw that Krabender had already done so. I thank you, he said. Krabender only asked him one thing. Have you seen Boromir? While he leapt over and fought down this side of the wall, he had lost sight of the man from Gondor, and that worried him. Together they searched, and it was Halder who saw him. "There he is!" he cried, pointing the shinobi to Boromir. Sasuke saw the Captain General fighting alone, while also helping the elves fall back to the keep. The Uruks seemed to have recognized the fact that he was a threat and began crowding him, forcing him to closer and closer to the edge of the deepening wall. The shinobi began fighting his way to him, only to watch as he slipped on a wet piece of rock and fell backwards from the wall. Sasuke wanted to look for him on the ground, but there was no time. The Uruks were swarming in and the elves were retreating. Instead, he slaughtered the Uruks that had forced Boromir over the edge and took the man's place in helping the elves flee back up to the keep. For every inch he gave up, he made sure that the Uruk-hai paid for it deeply with their deaths. But those inches grew and added up, despite the many dead Uruks lying on the wall. He was soon forced to retreat like the rest of them, running up the steps with the last of the elves. He and they ran through the door leading into the keep, and it was shut immediately. There was no time for words or questions. They had to keep helping with the defenses. The elves were rearranged so that they covered the entrance they came from and the wall around it. The rest of them went for the gate. The gate itself had been bashed in by the ram. It was a small hole at first, but when the Uruks charged forward again and rammed the gate, it made the hole bigger and able to send the ram through it, while also catching someone on the end of it. The ram was drawn back and Uruks with crossbows appeared at the hole, firing their bolts into the men behind the gate. A few of the men were struck by the bolts and killed, but they had bows and they returned fire with their arrows. Theoden saw what was happening at the gate and made a decision. To the gate, he said to the men beside him as he drew his sword, "Draw your swords." They did as they were ordered and quickly made their way down to the gate. Once there, they joined the confusion of the fight. It was tight spacing due to the fact that it was a confined area and there were a lot of people standing there alongside them. Theoden was given a little room since he was the king, and he used that room to get to the gate itself and attack the Uruks themselves. His attack didn't last long before one of the Uruks pierced his armor with a pike, hitting his shoulder. He dropped his sword in the brief moment of pain that followed, but he reacted quickly by taking an offered spear and with a great cry, plunged it into the Uruk's throat. He ripped out the pike, bringing a fresh wave of pain to his senses. He would have fallen had Gimli not grabbed him. "Make way!" cried Gimli as he pulled his king to safety. "We cannot hold much longer," he said to Theoden. They were out of harm's way. The gate gave way a bit, prompting the guardsmen to rejoin the fighting. Soon, Aragorn, Gimli, Sasuke, and Suigetsu along with the remaining members of the Seven Swordsmen joined the fight. "Hold them," Theoden told Aragorn over the din of the battle. "How long do you need?" Aragorn asked, looking back from the fight. He took back his sword from Gimli. "As long as you can give me," he answered. The ranger nodded and turned to his friends Gimli, "Sasuke," he said to them both, pushing them to a side passage. "Suigetsu," called out Sasuke. The wielder of the Kubikura Bocho followed only after ordering the rest of the swordsmen to stay there. Meanwhile, Theoden acted like the king he was, giving out commands. "Timbers!" he shouted to the men all around him. "Brace the gate!" As the Uruks raced to the hole in the gate and fought their way through it, a door in the wall to the right of the causeway opened, allowing Aragorn, Gimli, Sasuke, and Suigetsu to come out onto a small rocky ledge. Aragorn took the lead, creeping silently along the ledge to take a look at the Uruks at the gate. Gimli was right behind him and could see the same thing he saw. "Oh, come on! We can take them," he told the ranger. "It's a long way," Aragorn said in reply. Both Sasuke and Suigetsu took a quick look and saw that the distance between the ledge and the causeway was enough to make one pause. But for them, it would be no problem. Gimli, on the other hand, was shorter than the others and saw a problem with the distance. So, with great reluctance, he said something he had hoped never to say. "Toss me." Aragorn only heard him mumble and didn't exactly catch what he had said. "What?" he asked. "I cannot jump the distance. You'll have to toss me," the dwarf explained all in one breath. The ranger nodded once in understanding. He reached for the dwarf's back but stopped when Gimli raised his hand. "Neither of you are telling the elf this happened," he said quietly, pointing his finger at both Sasuke and Aragorn. Sasuke just nodded once in acknowledgement. Not a word, Aragorn promised. He grabbed hold of the dwarf and tossed him at the causeway. Gimli flew through the air with a great shout and landed on the uruks nearest to the gate. The other three quickly followed him onto the causeway. Back to back! Shouted Sasuke as he drew the katana and began killing the urukai. Aragorn and Gimli placed their backs against each other, and Suigetsu, despite not understanding what he had said, did the same with Sasuke. Together, they kept the gate clear of the urukai, and even pushing them back down the causeway. While they gave those behind the gate a respite, Theoden took it as an opportunity. "Shore up the door," he commanded. Soldiers immediately went off to get the beams of lumber sent aside for such a thing, and carried them back to the gate. Everyone soon joined in placing the beams in positions that would support the gate not being broken. But as they repaired the gate, the urukai were bringing another invention of Saruman's into play. 4 ballistas were being armed and knocked with giant grappling hooks pointed directly at the outer wall of the Hornburg. The first 2 were fired off successfully and hooked themselves onto the wall. While the defenders tried to get them free with no success, the uruks pulled the ropes attached to the hooks taut, allowing the giant siege ladders attached to the other end of the ropes to stand up, carrying many uruks on them. They landed themselves on the wall, and the urukai began to climb onto the wall. While the men and elves on the wall stopped the first few getting over, the rest soon came. The 3rd grappling hook was launched and attached, but Legolas took notice of this and fired 1 arrow at the rope attached to the hook. It was severed, and the ladder that was attached to the rope hung in the air before falling backwards and crushing several uruks beneath it. While the men and dwarf on the causeway saw this happen, they knew that there was nothing they could do about it. All they could do was keep their attention on the urukai on the causeway. Sasuke and Suigetsu were at the front. Aragorn and Gimli were at the back dealing with any that got past the first 2. It was a practical method, but the numbers were not on their side, and more uruks began slipping past Suigetsu and Sasuke. Eventually Theoden, who could see what was happening on the other side of the gate, called out to them. "Gimli! Aragorn!" He shouted to the 2 nearest to him, getting their attention. "Get out of there!" He helped put a beam of lumber over the hole he was talking through, ending the conversation. Since both of them had their attention on the king, Aragorn or Gimli did not see an uruk slip past Sasuke and Suigetsu, allowing said uruk to grab both of them. Legolas saw what was happening to them, and grabbed a bundle of rope. "Aragorn!" he called down to the ranger, throwing the rope down to them. Sasuke saw the uruk holding Aragorn and Gimli still. He stepped away from Suigetsu and swiftly decapitated the uruk, freeing the 2. "Go!" he urged them towards the rope. "We'll hold them back." Aragorn grabbed hold of both Gimli and the rope. As Legolas began to pull them to safety, the 4th ballista fired and landed on the outer wall, allowing a 3rd ladder to be pulled upward onto it. And still, the elf pulled the man and the dwarf up the wall, and then over it, to relative safety. "So why did they go and not us?" Suigetsu asked as the 2 of them faced the urukai alone. "They can't run up walls," Sasuke told him as he decapitated an uruk. "Not what I meant. They were leaving, why didn't we?" "I didn't think you would be a coward," he remarked. Suigetsu beheaded an uruk and then looked at him. "Nice try, Sasuke. Those attempts to get me riled up won't work anymore. I've grown up." He usually didn't say anything like what he was about to say, but this was just too good of an opportunity to pass up on. "Is that why Karen didn't come along?" The Kiri shinobi just scowled at him before going back to the battle. They tried to hold the tide back, but more and more uruks slipped past them and went for the gate. They gave ground to protect the gate, but that only allowed the uruks to press forward and crowd them more. It was only when Suigetsu got bludgeoned on the head and fell unconscious that Sasuke abandoned the defense. He grabbed hold of his companion and leapt to the wall. As he looked on at everything that was happening, Theoden could see where things were going. "Pull everybody back. Pull them back," he ordered Gamling. His guardsmen looked briefly at him with an expression of surprise and shock. But when the king walked away, he did as he was ordered. "Fall back! Fall back!" he shouted for all to hear. A few people did not believe the order when they heard it and held their positions. But there were more did and fell back as ordered. The confusion that followed was enough for the uruks to break through the supports on the gate. They have broken through. The castle is breached, Dodin shouted for all to hear as the Uruk-hai charged through the gate. Retreat! Retreat! As the men and elves retreated from their places on the walls and ran into the keep, Aragorn and the others were there to make sure that they got there. Hurry! Inside! Get them inside! Aragorn urged the defenders passing him by. There are stragglers! Legolas cried out, seeing that there were a few more soldiers still on the walls, still fighting even when they were getting swarmed by the Uruk-hai. We can't do anything for them, Sasuke told the elf as he tried to stem the flow of Uruks just a little longer. We have to go. While Legolas did not like what he said, there was no denying the truth. There was nothing they could do. The stragglers died quickly and the rest of the defenders soon barricaded themselves in the keep. Location: Fangorn. Treebeard walked through the forest with Pippin and Merry on his shoulders. Izuna walked beside the Ents' feet, always keeping a lookout for something moving in the trees. I will leave you at the western borders of the forest, Treebeard said to the hobbits. You can make your way north to your homeland from there. He looked at the half-elf among them. Then I shall take you to the eastern borders, Master Izuna, so you might head to Lothlorien. No one said a word. They were too shrouded in the feeling of defeat from the Ent moot. But as the Ent, Pippin had an idea that pierced through the shroud. Wait! Stop! Stop! He told the Ent, making him stop. Turn around. Turn around. Take us south. South? The Ent repeated, surprised at the words. But that will lead you past Isengard. Yes. Exactly, the Took's friends were confused by his words, so he explained it to them. If we go south, we can slip past Saruman unnoticed. The closer we are to danger, the farther we are from harm. It's the last thing he'll expect. That doesn't make sense to me, Treebeard admitted. But then, you are very small. Perhaps you're right. South it is, then. Hold on, little shirelings, he said to them as he turned around. I always like going south. Somehow it feels like going downhill. As they went in the new direction, Merry looked up at Pippin. Are you mad? He asked. We'll be caught. No, we won't, Pippin said in reply. Not this time. Izuna looked up at him when he heard those words. Does he have a plan? The half-elf asked himself. Whatever that plan was, he did know it. It was best now to just follow the Ent.